doors of the Green Valley Orphanage closed behind me when I was barely 6 years old. I remember the musty smell in the hallways, the creaking of the wooden stairs, and the whispers that seemed to come from every dark corner. The building, a Gothic structure with stone walls and tiny windows, had always had an air of sadness and mystery. But it was on my 10th birthday when I began to notice that something truly strange and terrifying was happening there at the orphanage. The routine was strict. We were woken at dawn and sent to bed early. But some nights, our sleep was interrupted by the sound of a faint, melancholy melody. It was an antique music box, a relic of times gone by, that was kept in the storage room on the second floor. The box was a beautiful object with inlaid narcissus and a porcelain bowl that turned to the music. The first time I heard the music, I thought someone else had turned it on. I got out of bed, guided by the melody, and headed to the storage room. When I opened the door, I found the music box on a table, its lid open, and the ballerina spinning slowly, but there was no one there. I closed the box and returned to my bed, trying to convince myself that it had only been my imagination. However, the following nights, the music started playing again. Other children also heard it and began to murmur stories of ghosts and spirits. Curiosity and fear took over us. We decided to investigate and find out what was making the music box play on its own. A group of us gathered one night to watch the box. We hid in the storage room, waiting in silence for midnight to arrive. As if obeying an invisible signal, the music box began to play. The ballerina spun, and the melody filled the room. There was no one near the box, and that only increased our terror. One of the children, the bravest of the group, approached the box and tried to close it, but the lid would not move, as if an invisible force held it. Suddenly, a chill ran through the room, and we all felt a presence. Something we couldn't see, but we knew was there. The music stopped abruptly, and the box closed by itself. The next day, we decided to talk to the oldest caretaker at the orphanage. She looked at us with a mix of concern and sadness when we told her what had happened. She took us to a secluded corner and began to tell us the story of the music box. Many years ago, the orphanage had been run by a kind woman who looked after all the children as if they were her own. Among the children, there was a little girl called Clara who adored music and used to play the box every night before going to sleep. Clara was a happy and lively girl, but one night during a strong storm, she disappeared without a trace. They searched for her in every corner of the orphanage but never found her. Soon after, the music box began to play by itself, and Clara's presence was felt in the orphanage. The caretaker warned us that Clara's spirit was trapped in the music box, unable to find peace. She told us that we should be careful and not disturb her because her sadness and anger could become dangerous. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about Clara and the pain she must feel, trapped in that box. I decided I had to help her find peace. The next day, I gathered my friends and told them my plan. We were determined to free Clara's spirit, although we didn't know exactly how to do it. We spent days researching in the orphanage library, looking for any clue on how to free a trapped spirit. We found an ancient ritual book that mentioned a ceremony to help spirits cross to the other side. We knew it was risky, but we also knew it was our only chance to help Clara. We waited for the next storm, the moment when Clara's presence was strongest. We gathered the necessary items for the ritual: candles, incense, and a medal that had belonged to Clara. We headed to the storage room and placed the music box in the center of the room. We lit the candles and incense and began to recite the words of the ritual. Music began to play again, but this time we weren't scared. We continued reciting the words, concentrating on our intention to free Clara. The room filled with an icy wind, and the candles flickered. We could feel Clara's presence stronger than ever. Suddenly, the music stopped, and a figure appeared in front of us. It was Clara, in her white dress and her sad expression. She looked at us with a mix of gratitude and sadness. We knew she had understood what we were trying to do. We finished the ritual, and a bright light filled the room. Clara smiled for the first time in years and slowly began to fade. The music box closed, and for the first time, the orphanage fell silent. The next few days were different. The orphanage seemed less gloomy, and a sense of peace came over us. We knew Clara had finally found the peace she so deserved. Although life at the orphanage continued, we never forgot Clara or the night we released her spirit. The music box remained in the storage room but never played alone again. It became a symbol of our bravery and the special connection we had shared with Clara. As we grew up and left the orphanage, we took with us the lesson that even in the darkest places, there is light and hope waiting to be discovered. Though our lives moved on, we will always remember the music box and the little girl whose spirit finally found peace. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos and like and share with your friends. The first time I heard the tune, I thought I was dreaming. It was a lullaby, soft and comforting but strangely sad. I woke up in the darkness of my bedroom at the Silver Oak Orphanage, trying to locate where the sound was coming from. It seemed like all the other children were still asleep. Their deep rhythmic breathing filled the room. The orphanage was a big, old place with long hallways and rooms that seemed to have been designed to confuse anyone unfamiliar with the place. The caretakers were strict, and the headmistress was a feared figure who rarely showed herself. The days were long and chore-filled, and the nights brought with them an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of wood and the murmur of the wind. That first night, I convinced myself that it must have been my imagination, and I went back to sleep. But the melody came back the next night and the next, always at the same time, just after the orphanage was plunged into complete darkness. The other children would talk about the song in whispers during the day, wondering if anyone else had heard it. No one would admit to being responsible. One night, I decided to follow the sound. I crept out of bed and padded down the hall barefoot, my heart pounding in my chest. The melody seemed to be coming from the attic, a place we rarely went. I climbed the wooden stairs, each step echoing in the silence, and pushed open the attic door. Creaked open. The attic was full of dust and cobwebs, and it smelled of old wood and damp. The moonlight came through a small window, casting long, twisted shadows. In one corner, I saw an old gramophone. The gramophone horn seemed to be almost alive, vibrating with the melody that filled the air. I walked closer, fascinated and terrified at the same time. There was no record in the gramophone. The horn spun by itself, producing the melody as if an invisible hand was handling it. I reached out to play it, but at that moment the melody stopped abruptly. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I stepped back, tripping over a box and falling to the floor. The next day, I told the other children what I had found. Some believed me, others thought I was making up stories. We decided to investigate together the next night. We returned to the attic as a group, armed with flashlights and the courage that being together gave us. When we arrived, the melody was already playing again. One of the children, braver than the rest, went up to the gramophone and tried to turn it off, but just like before, there were no records. We began to search around, going through the boxes and trunks that filled the attic. We found old toys, clothes, and books, but nothing to explain the music. Then one of the children found a box of photographs. The photos were old, black and white, and showed children and adults who had lived in the orphanage decades ago. In some of the photos, we saw the gramophone with a group of small children sitting around it, listening. There was a figure in the background, a woman with a stern expression that we recognized as the director of the orphanage at that time. We decided to show the photos to one of the caretakers, hoping that she would help us understand what was happening. The caretaker, a kind but frightened woman, told us that the gramophone had belonged to the former director, a woman who had been known for her cruelty. She told us stories of how she used to punish children brutally and how several had mysteriously disappeared during her tenure. She warned us to stop investigating and to stay away from the attic. But it was too late. Curiosity and fear had caught up with us. We went back that night and found more photographs. In one of them, we saw a group of children with sad faces and empty eyes. Behind them, the director smiled sinisterly, holding a record in her hand, the same one we had seen on the gramophone in the previous photos. The following nights, the melody became more persistent, and with it, strange things began to happen. We heard footsteps in the hallways, whispers in the dark, and shadows moving where no one should be. The The children began to have nightmares, dreams in which the old headmistress was coming to take them away. One night, while I was trying to sleep, the melody stopped abruptly and was replaced by a scream. We got out of bed, terrified, and ran to the attic. We found the brave little boy, the one who had tried to turn off the gramophone, lying on the floor, pale and trembling. He told us that he had seen the old headmistress, her translucent figure moving around the gramophone. We decided it was time to tell the current headmistress of the orphanage everything. We went to her office the next morning, taking the photographs with us. She listened to us with an incredulous expression, but when we showed her the photos, her face darkened. She told us that she had heard rumors about the old headmistress but had never believed them to be true. She called a priest to bless the orphanage and exorcise the attic. The priest arrived that afternoon, a serious old man who performed a ritual in the attic. The melody stopped, and for the first time in weeks we were able to sleep in peace. However, the relief was temporary. 2 nights later, the melody came back stronger and more desperate. This time, along with the music, we heard the screams and wails of the children who had disappeared. The current director told us that there must be a way to free those spirits, to give them the peace they so needed. We decided to investigate further into the history of the orphanage. We found old documents detailing the deaths of several children during the mandate of the former director. The causes of death were always vague, and the dates coincided with the years in which the children had disappeared. Finally, we found a diary hidden in a box in the attic. It was the diary of the former director. In it, she described how she had used the gramophone to attract children and how she performed dark rituals to prolong her life. Sacrifices were necessary, she said, and the gramophone was her tool to maintain control over the spirits of the children. With this information, we returned to the priest, who told us that we must destroy the gramophone to free the spirits. That night, we gathered our courage and returned to the attic. The gramophone was playing the melody, but this time, the figure of the former director was there, looking at each other with eyes full of hate. We approached cautiously, holding a lit candle and a hammer. While one of the children distracted the figure, another smashed the gramophone with the hammer. The melody suddenly stopped, and the figure of the director let out a heart-wrenching scream before disappearing into nothingness. The orphanage fell silent. The wails ceased, and the spirits of the children finally found peace. However, the impact of those events never left us. Despite having freed the spirits, the memories of those terrifying nights were etched in our memory forever. The orphanage was closed soon after, and we were moved to other places where we tried to rebuild our lives. Although we never forgot the horror we had faced in that old building, we carried on, knowing that sometimes, even in the darkest of times, we can find the strength to overcome and bring peace to those who have suffered. My first memory of the orphanage is the darkness. I arrived there when I was very small, abandoned at the door on a cold winter night. The building was an imposing and ancient structure with large stone walls and small windows that barely let in light. From the first day, a feeling of unease took hold of me, as if the place kept secrets that it didn't want to reveal. The storms at the orphanage were especially terrifying. Every time the sky was covered with dark clouds and the thunder began to rumble, an indescribable fear took over all the children. The caretakers used to lock us in our rooms, assuring us that it was for our own safety. However, it wasn't the fear of the storm that scared us, but the screams during the storms. The screams began to echo throughout the building. At first, I thought they came from outside, perhaps from someone caught in the storm. But soon, I realized that the screams came from inside, specifically from the basement. Nobody spoke about it openly, but we all knew that something terrible was happening down there. One night, the storm was particularly violent. The lightning lit up the sky, and the thunder shook the walls of the orphanage. I found myself in my bed, covered up to my head, trying to drown out the screams that became increasingly louder and desperate. I couldn't stand it any longer. I decided to investigate, although fear paralyzed me. I got up and left my room, slipping through the dark, cold hallways. The orphanage was silent, save for the screams that were now almost deafening. I reached the door that led to the basement and, with rum, forcefully pulled it open. A cold, damp air hit me, and I descended the creaking wooden stairs. The basement was a gloomy place with stone walls and poor lighting. There were old boxes and broken furniture stacked in the corners, covered in dust and cobwebs. The screams were more intense here and seemed to come from everywhere. I felt a presence, something I couldn't see but knew was there. As I moved further into the basement, I saw an iron door at the end of the hallway. It looked ancient and rusty, as if it hadn't been opened in years. I approached slowly. My hands shook as I turned the handle. The door opened with a terrifying creak, revealing a dark, empty room. But it wasn't empty. The screams echoed with incredible force, and I could feel the pain and desperation in each one of them. Then I saw them, shadows moving around the room. Small figures that looked like children were trapped in an endless cycle of suffering, trying to escape but not being able to. I realized that these were the spirits of children who had died in a fire many years ago when the orphanage was even older. The fire had started in the basement, and many children were trapped there, dying in horrible agony. Their spirits had never found peace, and during the storms, their screams filled the orphanage as they sought to escape their eternal torment. I felt a deep sadness and a need to help them. I knew I couldn't do it alone, so I went back to my room and waited for dawn to break. The next day, I told some of the older children what I had seen. At first, they didn't believe me, but when they returned and the screams started again, they decided to help me. We met in secret and discussed a plan to free the spirits. We researched the history of the orphanage and discovered that there was a way to exorcise the trapped spirits, a ceremony that had to be performed in the same place where they had died. We waited for the next storm, and when the screams started, we went down to the basement with candles and the ancient book we had found in the orphanage library. We followed the instructions of the ritual, lighting the candles and reciting the ancient words. The screams grew more intense, as if the spirits knew that we were trying to free them. The room filled with an icy wind, and the shadows began to move frantically, but we continued with the ritual despite the fear that paralyzed us. Finally, a lightning bolt illuminated the room, and the screams stopped abruptly. The air became lighter, and the shadows disappeared. We felt a peace that we had never felt before in the orphanage. We knew that we had freed the spirits of the children, giving them the peace that they so deserved. Although the orphanage was still a sad and gloomy place, it was no longer plagued by the screams of the trapped children. The storms continued, but the screams never returned. We knew that we had done the right thing, and although the scars of that experience would always be with us, we were at peace, knowing that we had helped those children find freedom. The orphanage would eventually close, and we were all moved to other places. Although my life went on, I will always remember the screams of the storms and the night we freed the spirits trapped in the basement. It was a story that many would not believe, but for us, it was a truth that we carry in our hearts. Proof that even in the darkest places, there is light and hope waiting to be discovered. Since I was a child, I had always felt a strange fascination for stories of orphanages. Maybe it was the melancholic air that surrounded them, a mixture of hope and sadness that always attracted me. It was not a surprise to anyone when I decided to dedicate myself to caring for homeless children. After years of study and work, I was finally hired at an orphanage located on a hill on the outskirts of the city, an isolated place with an old building that had seen better days but still maintained its charm. From the first day, I felt a special connection with the children. Their laughter, their dreams, and their fears became an integral part of my life. Although the work was exhausting, it filled me with a satisfaction that few could understand. The orphanage was large, with many hidden corners and a huge attic that was rarely visited. However, one day, curiosity drove me to explore it. The attic was filled with dust and stacked boxes, silent witnesses to years of neglect. As I rummaged through the boxes, my eyes fell on something that left me frozen: an antique doll. It was a magnificent piece with a lace dress and a hand-painted face that looked almost real. Without thinking much, I decided to take it to one of the younger girls, who immediately took a liking to the doll. From the moment the doll entered the orphanage, things began to change. At first, it was small incidents. Toys disappearing, lights flickering for no apparent reason, doors slamming shut. Children began whispering to each other about the doll, saying they could hear her talk in the night. I attributed it to the children's active imaginations and went on with my routine. However, things became more sinister. One night, as I was making my nightly rounds, I heard a heart-wrenching scream. I ran towards the source of the scream and found one of the children on the floor, crying and pointing to a dark corner of the hallway. He told me that the doll had pushed him. I tried to calm him down, assuring him that he had only had a nightmare. However, the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. The incidents continued. A child fell down the stairs. Another suffered unexplained cuts on his hands. Every time something happened, the doll was always nearby. One night, while I was in my room, I heard a soft whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I felt a chill run down my spine, and steeling myself, I followed the sound to the room where the doll was. I found it sitting on the bed, its gaze fixed on the door as if it were waiting for me. I decided that was enough. I took the doll and took it back to the attic, hiding it so that no one could find it. I thought that would put an end to the problems, but I was wrong. That same night, the orphanage was consumed by a fire. The flames spread with terrifying speed. Desperate, I helped the children get out, making sure that everyone was safe. While the building burned, a feeling of desperation burned through me. I knew that the doll had somehow been the cause of everything. After the fire, the orphanage was closed, and the children moved to other facilities. I was scarred by the experience. I quit my job and moved far away, trying to leave behind the horror of those days. However, the memory of the doll and the screams of the children in the middle of the flames never left me. Over time, I tried to rebuild my life. I worked in different places, but I always carried with me the guilt and fear. I never spoke of what happened again, but in my nightmares, the doll kept appearing with its fixed gaze and its evil smile. One day, I received a letter from one of the former caretakers of the orphanage, telling me that he had found information about the doll. According to his research, the doll had belonged to a girl who lived in the orphanage many years ago. The girl had died under mysterious circumstances, and it was said that her spirit had been trapped in the doll. Terrified, the caretaker asked me to come see him to discuss what to do. Although every fiber of my being told me to stay away, the need to put an end to that dark chapter of my life was stronger. I headed to the address that had been given to me, a small house in a remote village. Upon arrival, the caretaker greeted me with a serious expression. He showed me the documents and photographs that he had found. The stories were terrifying. Accidents, unexplained deaths, all related to the doll. We decided that the only way to free the spirit was to destroy the doll. However, when we returned to the ruined orphanage, the doll had disappeared. I felt a chill run through my body. Someone else had found it, and the cycle of terror was about to begin again. Years later, I still live with the constant fear that the doll will reappear. Every time I hear a news story about a fire or an unexplained accident in an orphanage, my heart stops for a moment. I don't know if I will ever find peace, but one thing is certain. The doll is still out there, waiting for its next victim, and I am forever marked by the horror of those days. The aftermath of the fire was devastating, both physically and emotionally. The children, although safe, were traumatized. Their gazes reflected the terror of that night, and I was weighed down by the knowledge that somehow I had failed to protect them. The orphanage, once filled with laughter and hope, was reduced to charred rubble. As I looked out at the ruins, a feeling of helplessness washed over me. How could something so malevolent have found its way to us? The next few days were a blur of interrogations and procedures. The authorities searched for answers, but I knew they would never be able to understand the true cause of the fire. No one would believe that a doll had triggered the tragedy. I decided to keep the secret, carrying the burden alone. Over time, the children were reassigned to other orphanages. Each goodbye was a reminder of failure. I tried to stay strong, but every night, the memories of those moments haunted me. The images of the doll and the terrified faces of the children repeated themselves in my dreams, leaving me in a constant state of anxiety. Despite everything, I felt the need to find answers. I began to investigate the story of the orphanage and the doll. I discovered that the building had been a psychiatric hospital in the 19th century, and that the doll had belonged to one of the patients. The girl, according to the records, had been subjected to inhumane treatments, and in her desperation had made a dark pact. Her spirit, filled with anger and pain, had become trapped in the doll. Each fragment of information I obtained filled me with horror. I felt like I was unearthing secrets that should have remained hidden. However, the need to understand and perhaps find a way to appease the spirit drove me on. One day, while looking through old newspapers in the local library, I found an article about a series of unexplained fires in the region, all linked to the presence of the same doll. Each fire had resulted in the deaths of children and caregivers. The similarities to our case were disturbing. I felt a mixture of terror and determination. I knew I had to stop the cycle somehow. I recontacted the former caregiver who had written to me. Together, we decided that the only way to end the terror was to perform an exorcism ritual to free the spirit. Trapped, however, the challenge was to find the doll that seemed to have disappeared without a trace. The search was arduous and full of obstacles. We traveled to different cities, following clues and rumors. Every time we thought we were close, the doll would escape us, as if the spirit knew of our plans and was mocking us. Finally, after months of searching, we received a promising lead. An antique store in a small town had recently acquired a doll that matched our description. We headed there immediately. Upon entering the store, a chill ran through my body. The doll was on display in a glass case. Its fixed and empty gaze seemed to follow me. With my heart racing, we bought the doll and headed to a secluded place to perform the ritual. We followed the instructions to the letter, hoping that it would work. As we recited the words, the atmosphere became dense and oppressive. Suddenly, an invisible force hit us, knocking us down. At that moment, I knew that the spirit would not go away without a fight. We stood up and continued the ritual with greater determination. The doll began to shake, and a guttural voice filled the air. It screamed words in an ancient language we didn't understand, but its tone was filled with hate and desperation. With a last effort, we threw the doll into the fire we had prepared. The flames engulfed it, and the air filled with a deafening shriek. As the doll burned, I felt a pressure released from my shoulders. The scream faded, and the atmosphere returned to normal. We had freed the spirit, but the cost was high. The emotional scars of those dark days remain with me. Although the cycle of terror seemed to have ended, the weight of guilt and fear remains a constant burden. I don't know if I'll ever be able to find complete peace, but at least I can live in hope that others won't have to face the same horror as us. Mexico City, with its vibrant nightlife and bustling daytime activity, houses dark corners that contrast with its appearance modern and lively. One of those corners is an old house in the Coyoacan neighborhood, a building that for decades has been the epicenter of horror stories and unexplained phenomena. The house that once functioned as an orphanage has been the subject of numerous urban legends and tales of paranormal activity. Since I was a child, I had heard about the place and always felt a mix of fascination and fear for its stories. I decided, perhaps imprudently, that I wanted to personally investigate and document any phenomenon I could find. I arrived at the house on a cloudy afternoon when the sun was setting behind thick gray clouds, giving way to an even more gloomy air. The facade of the house was in a state of obvious abandonment, with broken windows and peeling paint. The rusty and creaking wrought iron doors welcomed you to a neglected garden where the vegetation grew out of control. A jacaranda tree with its branches spread out like skeletal fingers dominated the landscape, adding a macabre touch to the environment. Crossing the threshold of the main door was like entering another world. The temperature inside the house was noticeably colder, and the air was heavy with an oppressive heaviness. I turned on my flashlight, projecting beams of light that revealed a wide hallway covered in dust and debris. Antique furniture covered with stained sheets lined the walls. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of aged wood beneath my feet. I had brought with me a high-definition camera, an audio recorder, and several devices to measure temperature changes and electromagnetic fields. My goal was to capture any evidence of the paranormal. Although deep down I expected to find nothing, I began to explore the rooms on the first floor, each one more desolate than the last. The dining room had a long, solid wooden table with the remains of rusty crockery and cutlery, as if the place had been suddenly abandoned. As I walked along, I began to feel a presence. It was a sensation that was difficult to describe, as if someone was watching me from the shadows in the back of my mind. The stories of dark rituals and child sacrifices echoed, feeding my growing uneasiness. I decided to continue moving towards the stairs that led to the second floor, where, according to accounts, the most disturbing events had been concentrated. Walking up the stairs was an experience in itself. Each step creaked under my weight, and the air seemed to get even colder. As I reached the second floor, the atmosphere changed drastically. The walls were decorated with childish drawings, many of them showing scenes of fear and despair. Most of the room doors were open, revealing small beds and broken furniture. It was at that moment I heard the first whisper. It was a barely audible sound, like a distant conversation, but clear enough to make me stop dead in my tracks. I turned on the audio recorder and began recording the sounds as I walked down the hallway. The whispers grew louder, mixing with soft laughter and moans of pain. My skin prickled, and a chill ran up my spine. The feeling of being watched was now overwhelming, almost tangible. I decided to enter one of the rooms that seemed to have been a playroom. The old dusty toys were scattered around the room. I felt a slight tug on my jacket, as if an invisible hand was trying to get my attention. I looked around but saw nothing. The temperature suddenly dropped, and I turned into a cloud of steam in the cold air. I continued recording, moving towards the next room that seemed to have been a collective dormitory. The small beds were lined up along the walls, and in one corner, there was an improvised altar with melted candles and strange symbols drawn on the floor. The atmosphere in this room was stifling, charged with a negative energy that could almost be cut with a knife. I approached the altar, feeling a growing pressure in my chest. The whispers turned into screams of anguish, echoing in my ears with an almost painful intensity. I decided to check the readings of my devices. The temperature had dropped several degrees in a matter of minutes, and the electromagnetic field meter was registering abnormal levels of activity. I took out my camera and began filming, capturing every detail of the room and the altar. It was then that something happened in front of me, a quick and fleeting shadow that seemed to move with intention. I felt a blow to my back, strong enough to make me stagger. I looked around, but there was no one. Panic began to set in. I knew I had to stay calm and continue documenting, but the feeling of imminent danger was overwhelming. I decided to go down to the first floor, hoping that the atmosphere would be less oppressive. As I descended the stairs, I heard footsteps behind me, as if someone was following me closely. I did not dare look back until I reached the hall back on the first floor. The oppression eased slightly, but the whispers and laughter did not cease. I headed towards the kitchen, a place that, according to some accounts, had witnessed particularly sinister activities. The kitchen was in a deplorable state, with old appliances and fallen furniture. The smell of love and decay was almost unbearable. As I examined the room, I noticed a small door in the corner that led to a basement. I hesitated for a moment, but my desire to complete the investigation overcame my fear. I opened the door and began to descend through the wooden stairs. The basement was even colder and darker, with a silence that was only broken by the occasional drip of water. I turned on my flashlight and moved forward cautiously. The space was large, with shelves full of ancient objects and dust accumulated in one corner. I saw a circle drawn on the floor with symbols I didn't recognize. Melted candles and remains of what seemed to be offerings were scattered around. The atmosphere in the basement was thick and oppressive, and the feeling of being watched was almost palpable. I decided to place my audio recorder in the center of the circle and start asking questions, hoping to capture some answer. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a presence approaching. The air grew colder, and a chill ran down my spine. It was then that the flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me in complete darkness. My heart was pounding as I tried to turn the flashlight back on. When I finally succeeded, I saw something that paralyzed me. A childlike figure standing in the center of the circle, looking at me with empty eyes. His skin was pale and his clothes were torn apart. I couldn't move. Fear had caught me in its icy embrace. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the impact of its presence remained. I decided it was time to leave. I quickly gathered my equipment and climbed the stairs without looking back. As I left the basement, the oppression lessened, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away entirely. I left the house. The cool night air hit me, providing temporary relief. I looked back at the house one last time. The dark windows looked like watchful eyes, and I knew I would never forget what I had experienced there. I spent the next few days reviewing the recordings and the data I had collected. The audios clearly contained whispers and laughter, and the images showed shadows moving about the rooms. The readings from the devices confirmed the anomalies. I decided to share my findings with a group of paranormal investigators who were interested in carrying out a more thorough investigation. The house in Coyoacan, with its history of dark rituals and sacrifices, remained an enigma. Although I had managed to capture evidence of the paranormal, I felt that I had only scratched the surface of the horrors that it harbored. I knew that the spirits of the children, victims of those dark rituals, were still trapped there, looking for a way to communicate their suffering and find peace. The experience left me marked for life. The nightmares and the feeling of being watched accompanied me for weeks after my visit to the house. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows and heard the whispers of the children. The memories of that child figure in the basement repeated themselves in my mind, trapping me in a state of constant unease. Although initially skeptical, when listening to my recordings and seeing the images I had captured, the paranormal investigator's attitude changed. He recommended meditation and visualization techniques to try to calm my mind and release the negative energy that I had absorbed in the house. Meanwhile, the paranormal investigators, with whom I had shared my findings, organized a more formal expedition to the orphanage. They invited me to join them, but I declined. I could not face the horrors of that place again. However, I kept in touch with them closely, monitoring their progress over the weeks that followed. The investigators made multiple visits to the mansion using advanced equipment and scientific methods to document the paranormal activity. They captured clear psychophonies, shadow images, and extreme temperature fluctuations. One of the investigators, an experienced medium, managed to establish communication with some of the spirits. According to their accounts, the children were trapped due to the dark rituals they had undergone, their souls unable to find rest. The medium suggested performing a ritual of release in hopes of helping the spirits cross over to the other side and find peace. They agreed to do so during a full moon night when the spiritual energy would be strongest. I was invited to witness the event, and although I was afraid, I felt a moral obligation to be there. Perhaps in some way, I could help alleviate the suffering of those children. The night of the ritual, the mansion was shrouded in a thick fog that added an air of mystery and anticipation. The investigators prepared the place carefully, lighting candles and placing protective crystals around the circle of symbols in the basement. The medium began to recite prayers and chants in an ancient language, asking the spirits to manifest and accept release. The atmosphere became dense, charged with palpable energy. The shadows began to move again, and whispers filled the air. I felt a presence behind me. As I turned, I saw several children figures watching us from the shadows. The medium continued his ritual, his voice resonating with a calm and compassionate authority. As the ritual progressed, the figures began to approach the circle, attracted by the promise of release. One by one, the spirits of the children entered the circle of light, and the medium extended his hands towards them, guiding them towards peace. The whispers transformed into sighs of relief, and the shadows began to slowly fade like smoke dissipating into the air. I felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of sadness and joy. I was witnessing something deeply sacred and human. The children who had suffered so much were finally finding the peace they deserved. The temperature in the room began to rise, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The orphanage, though still marked by its past, was no longer a place of suffering. In the days that followed, my life began to return to normal. The nightmares ceased, and the feeling of being watched disappeared. I continued my therapy, working to process the experience and understand its impact on me. The researchers published their findings, and the story of the orphanage and the children they had suffered spread widely. The house became a memorial, a reminder of the importance of protecting the most vulnerable and not forgetting the past. I visited the memorial times, leaving flowers and remembering the children. I knew that their stories would never be forgotten, and that in some way, I had contributed to bringing them peace. The experience changed me forever, teaching me about the fragility of life and the importance of facing fear with courage and compassion.